Okay, so in part two of the week one content, I'm going to just do a quite brief explanation of some of the work of the Frankfurt School that have become associated with the very term critical theory. And much of the work about consumption in the post-cultural turn is writing under the influence of the Frankfurt School, or if not against them. That's how kind of influential this work is. They've been really prominent and very key in terms of developing Marxist thought, to start considering cultural and consumption aspects, and they have become synonymous with the idea of critical theory. So the key theorists I'm going to talk about today, quite briefly, are Adorno, Marcuse and Benjamin, but there's a whole heap of others, including Horkheim, Erich Fromm, and in the contemporary realm, people like Jürgen Habermas and Axel Honneth, kind of the next kind of generation that came after the original people in the Frankfurt School. So their work is profoundly influential. They're heavily influenced by the work of Marx, but they also start incorporating a lot of Freud and many others' philosophical points of view into their work. And they start to bring in considerations of culture into the Marxist thought. They start thinking about maybe why this revolution hasn't happened that Marx talked about, even though much of the relations that between classes that Marx predicted was happening, and things like inequality and alienation and exploitation were very prevalent. There was no working class revolution, and these theorists start to kind of extrapolate out of the contemporary situations that they were writing in some reasons why this may not be happening. Essentially, they start pointing the finger at mass consumption and consumer culture and popular culture. They argue that essentially that these things are the key disseminators of capitalist ideology, that they keep the population sedated and stupid, and it encourages people to express their selves through modes of consumption, through things like fashion and taste, rather than through what they argue are our true needs of kind of creativity and things like that. Essentially, they argue that stuff like consumer culture and pop culture really destroys humans' possibility of being creative beings. So here, culture is an ideology, it serves dominant interests, and they're particularly concerned with why the so-called masses haven't galvanised from their exploitated class position and seized the means of production in that Marxist sense. So again, here, those that have done Soccer 101 might be familiar with some of these ideas already that we spoke about, and will remember that it's important to consider the time and place when these people were writing. Particularly, they were, academics in Germany in the 1930s. The rise of Nazism. They were seen as kind of radicals, and many of them were Jewish, so they had to get out. Adorno and Marcuse make it to the US, where they were kind of almost shocked by the overt commercialization of the culture there, as opposed to what it was like in Germany. Benjamin wasn't so lucky. He was stopped by soldiers at the Franco-Spanish border when his group was detained overnight. Rather than going to the gulags, was what he thought was going to happen to him, he committed suicide. So you can see there's real overt political circumstances at the time that influenced these people's thought. And particularly for Adorno and Marcuse, when they made it to America, they started to play off the idea of totalitarianism, that the totalitarianism of Nazi Germany was underpinned by overt threats of physical violence and death. They argued that there was still a kind of totalitarian authority in the US, but the way that it was kind of disseminated was more subtle. It was disseminated through the ideological mechanisms of the media and the advertising, and what Adorno come to call the culture industry. So we'll start with Adorno. Adorno is particularly critical of mass, or what we would call popular culture. He argues that essentially mass culture stands under the sign of terror. He argues here that participation in it essentially makes people not think, not care, and kind of just blindly pursue instant gratification rather than, long-term progressive social needs. So he coins the term the culture industry, which has become, a key term very commonly used both in social thought, but also, out there in the media and politics now. So here's a quote I like to use to try and get the gist of the way that Adorno writes and thinks about culture industry. You can tell that he's hasn't got anything good to say about it. The culture industry, this is consumer culture, advertising, and the culture industry is around things like Hollywood and the music industry and stuff like that. They intentionally integrate its consumers from above. They force together the spheres of high and low art, which destroys the seriousness of high art. What parades as progress in the culture industry remains the disguise for an eternal sameness. The manifestations of the culture industry are vacuous, banal, or worse, and the behaviour patterns are shamelessly conformist. The culture industry proclaims you shall conform without instruction to what? For Adorno, conformity has replaced consciousness. The consensus that the culture industry builds propagates and strengthens blind, opaque authority. So you can see here that Adorno has very little good things to say about this stuff. Now, some of the key concepts beyond the culture industry that Adorno wants to promote to think about what consumer culture does, he argues that it promotes what he calls pseudo individuality. What the culture industry does is endow mass-produced products with the halo of free choice. So what he means by this is that that when we go out to shop or we go out to buy a record or go out to see a film, we might think that the one we buy this week is different than last week, or the one we watch this week is different than last week, but really there's only really small differences between them. They're all produced in fairly formulaic ways, and they certainly, in Adorno's sense, do not challenge the status quo at all. And so what this means is we just kind of go on this kind of consumer treadmill, consuming things that we think are different and pick and choosing and kind of making our self-identity through those. But really, we can only choose what the culture industry provides. Therefore, this kind of destroys the very idea of choice. And so when you go to the supermarket here, there might be, 30 different brands of rice, but let's face it, in the end, it's all rice. 30 different brands and coloured washing powders, but really it's all the same stuff. So we can choose the box, with the colour or the whatever we think it may do that suits us and expresses our individuality or whatever, but from the Adornian point of view, this is pseudo-individuality. When we think about this in popular culture, he also wants us to think about how really whether it's films or music or whatever, the products that come out of these industries are essentially always the same. Now, whether it's like a female singer-songwriter or a heavy metal band, whether it's, a boy band like One Direction or a apparently punk band like Blink-182, at the Adornian point of view, they're all the same. And even if they're singing, political lyrics, that makes it even worse in some sense, because it'll give the consumer a feeling that they're being political, where really they're just consuming. So Adorno wants us to think about the formulaic nature of everything that's produced in the culture industries and in broader consumer senses as well in terms of advertising. Importantly here, you think you can point to movies that tend to have very similar narratives regardless of what they are. Songs on the radio tend to be verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end. This is the kind of formulaic stuff that promotes pseudo-individuality. We feel like we might be choosing different things, but really they're just symbolically or cosmetically different. And from Adorno's point of view, they play exactly the same role in terms of, making the masses stupid or sedate. Marcuse is also an important figure in this, in the Frankfurt School, particularly his book, One-Dimensional Man, that was very influential in the 60s on various forms of radical politics in particular. Marcuse was writing at a time after the Second World War, and where there was kind of this notion that there was the end of ideology, that democracy had won, and that was kind of going to be no real need for clashes of ideology in the future. and this is in America in particular. Marcuse argued that what was happening here was a manufactured consensus, and the manufacturing was done largely through the media again and through advertising in particular. So media, news and advertising were the key disseminators of trying to manufacture this kind of capitalist consensus around how life will need to be about consumption. So as capital was becoming more centralized, that means that less and less people were owning more and more of it. Technology is increasing at a rapid rate. Mass production can happen much easier and efficiently. The media becomes saturated in our lives, and bureaucracy grows at a rapid rate as well. And this reflects much of the work of Max Weber. He argues that there was a reorganise of politics and economics going on, that to try and keep people in their place, there needed to be a kind of a key enemy organised to make people kind of fearful. And a fearful population is one that's easily disciplined and easily regulated. So here, Marcuse points to huge sums of money spent on nuclear weapons, and the escalating tensions between capitalism and communism that kind of resulted in the Cold War. Marcuse theorises that that Western democratic and consumer cultures needed an enemy to kind of pour their attention to be distracted from the fact that their lives were becoming kind of meaningless through these kind of consumption practices that Adorno talks about. Now, since then, as kind of the 80s and 90s saw maybe, in some respects, the threat of nuclear war diminish, some would argue it just kind of went out of the news more. It then kind of replaced with maybe the common enemy of the war on terror and Islamophobia, and maybe more recently you could argue that our common enemy may be returning to the threat of nuclear war again since the rise of Trump. But here I think, we can point to some empirical examples of how whether it's Australia, the consensus around Australia, the US and UK being kind of allies, have tended to organise much of their political energy and directed it towards common enemies over those times. So for Marcuse, and again this echoes Weber's notion of bureaucracy as well, there's a new conformism which is a facet of technological rationality, and this translates into our social behaviour. So he's pointing here to the advanced notion of the way consumer culture becomes possible, and more consumption becomes possible because of that. Technology creates wealth. This kind of allows a kind of freedom from material needs. That Maslow hierarchy of needs that we need to live to be comfortable, having food and air and water and shelter and warmth. He argues that, the technical developments tended to start to cover most of those things for most people in the West anyway. Obviously, there's still huge problems with inequality and homelessness. But what this meant is that when people were kind of, going to work and forced to work, in that Marxist sense, to sell their labour as the only way as a means of living, as these kind of needs become covered, there need to be a change in ideology and a change in terms of what people are encouraged to think that their work was for. And so consumer culture starts to replace those basic needs. So once we have, food and a house and stuff like that to live in, it would be easy then for us to stop trying, stop consuming, stop working so hard. Marcuse argues that the system therefore needs to create false needs. That is, the need to have consumer products, to be cool, to have high status, to keep the system going. So here he's talking about this kind of paradox here. He understands there's a paradox going on between the notion that consumer culture dominates us, but also satisfies us. But he argues that the needs that consumer culture produces are actually false needs. Really, they're wants, and they are exploited through the desire-making processes of the culture industry and the advertising. So here Marcuse makes a distinction between false and true needs. Again, true needs in this sense, beyond the material, that kind of notion that the true species being of humans is to be creative and to communicate through their creative capacities. Marcuse argues that what consumer culture does is create false needs where our expressions are based through buying stuff. And this is kind of a way, again, of keeping us in our place. So again, here's some writings directly from Marcuse so you can get the feel of how he writes about this stuff. Our media have little difficulty in telling particular interests. The political needs of society become the needs and aspirations, individuals' needs and aspirations. Their satisfactions promotes business. Yet this society is irrational as a whole. Most of the prevailing needs to relax, to have fun, to behave and to consume in accordance to the advertisements, to love and to hate what others love and hate, belong to the category of false needs. So Marcuse wants us to think about this in terms of everyday life, harking back to part one of the lecture here. Marcuse argues that these processes depoliticise everyday life, and even more critical, that what happens is that as individuals, our ability to critically think is stunted, because the ways that we communicate and the ways that we think tend to be done through this consumer lens at all times. He also starts to think about how as technology comes to dominate, it becomes to dominate us, and media and technology mean that we're forced to think less, and therefore we're guided by what he calls instrumental reason. We're kind of subsumed in this package culture. Everything's homogenised, standardised, satirised, and you can see how that relates to Adorno's work. And particularly the advertising industry is what shapes our false needs. It turns wants into needs and kind of motivates us to pursue those wants through the creation of desire, particularly around status. Now, an interesting thing that I think I just wanted to touch upon here in terms of how Marcuse talks about this is in terms of everyday life and our less ability to critically think, is what he calls the pasteurization of our language. He argues that as media becomes more about spectacle, more about selling us stuff, that it kind of distorts our language. It uses kind of, language in a kind of extreme way all the time, particularly in advertising and particularly in the news. And this becomes a way of stunting our thought. Language becomes subsumed in the way of consumer culture. It's about products, lifestyles and ideologies, and it kind of short circuits our possibilities to dissent. Now you can see this in the way that wars are reported. There's kind of notions of collateral damage, friendly fire and smart bombs that are kind of these little euphemisms that hide the real meaning of what's going on. But more broadly, you can think about the way that language is used in the media. It's always really hyper. And the example I like to use to talk about this is, is something like fashion, where if an actress, wears a dress on the red carpet and it's, all of a sudden seen by the tastemakers as being, no good or untrendy or something, it can be described as an atrocity. It's a fashion atrocity. Marcuse's an influenced analysis of that would say that if we're describing fashion items as an atrocity, how are we left with a language to describe actual atrocities such as genocide and war and things like that? So this is a kind of way of thinking about how media affects our everyday life and the discourses that we use to communicate. Okay, the third Frankfurt School theorist that I want to touch upon, I'm going to only very quickly, is Walter Benjamin, and particularly the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Benjamin's also really well known for his concept of flaneur that might have came up in some other courses as well. In this work, Benjamin's concerned with the way that art and the art itself, the meaning of art and its aura, will be fundamentally changed by the way that media technology will influence it. Now, this again was written in the 30s when photography and film become new technologies, and Benjamin argues that the way that art will be produced will be changed because essentially art will be produced to be reproduced through photography and through film. And I suppose today you could add the internet to that. So Benjamin argues that the way that the work of art has been traditionally experienced is by going to a gallery and being in front of it, being affected by its aura, and being able to kind of stand in front of it and contemplate what's going on. And there's a kind of ritual around that makes us think in a particular critical way. And it maybe kind of produce some kind of cathartic release and maybe promote, critical ways of thinking. For Benjamin, though, that as, film and photography become these technologies that much art is now disseminated through and becomes a way that we view it, less and less people go to galleries now, more and more people look at pictures of paintings and pictures of sculptures and stuff like that rather than see them in the actual gallery. For Benjamin, this means that the actual aura and the political impact of art will wither away, because not only does our own individual kind of experience of it and the way that it affects us has changed, that it means that art itself becomes produced to be reproduced through those mediums. So the technique of reproduction brings art objects closer to a mass audience. So in some ways it democratizes the ability to see art, because you don't have to be a kind of elite person normally living in a city to go to a museum. More and more people can view it. But this creates a kind of reversibility as well, that the work of art becomes produced for reproducibility, which means it becomes easily mass consumed and mass produced. So you can see this in 20th century art. Many people would argue that the likes of Warhol and Duchamp in particular, their work is a kind of, some ways, a critical engagement with that. Some people are really critical of someone like Damien Hirst, for instance, who seems to profit immensely off being able to reproduce art, many times, and selling it for millions of dollars in CEOs' boardrooms. And it's an interesting way to think about it. I never really agreed with this too much until that I saw one particular artwork in Glasgow, a Salvador Dali piece that I'd seen, online or in books before, and when I saw it in the gallery, I actually gasped when I saw it the first time. The way that it was lit, it really had a kind of a real effect on me emotionally that it never had when looking at her books before. So I think in many ways Benjamin has some really interesting things to say here, and Benjamin's work is really influential on Jean Baudrillard and Barthes that come up later in the course as well. I've linked to a YouTube video there of a classic documentary from the 70s and 80s called Ways of Seeing, where John Berger brings together some of the kind of Frankfurt School understandings, but also semiotic theories that I'm going to talk about in a minute, to get us to think about how art has an ideological underpinning in the modern day world. So if you're interested in the history of art and you're interested in thinking about critically about what art means in the 20th century and beyond, that documentary and the book that came out of it is like a foundational text. Okay, just quickly, just touching upon some of criticisms of the Frankfurt School. Many people argue they're elitists. Within sociology too, they're kind of seen as a more philosophical way of thinking about things, where sociologists and anthropologists often go out and gather data around these practices and find much more complex stuff going on, which is what we'll look at throughout the course. They're very negative towards pop culture and obviously see there's no possibility of any kind of true meaning or political work or resistance going on within it. There's a kind of interesting juxtaposition here on who gets to decide what false and true needs are. Again, maybe this is the true and false needs being defined by quite elite white males, and particularly from a European perspective. A more kind of philosophical question is that if there's a false consciousness, how do you know? Why do Marxist theorists be able to say that everyone else has a false consciousness? Surely means that if well-educated elites can make that kind of discovery, that it means that at least people on a day-to-day basis may have some kind of inclination of that themselves. There's criticisms about what things like music and art would actually be in a communist utopia. What would they actually be? Wouldn't they just be a different ideology then? And others talk about maybe this revolution hasn't happened because it doesn't actually suit true human needs, and maybe that's a kind of key criticism of Marxist thought. So as I said, Frankfurt School have been profoundly influential. I've just touched upon many of their ideas here, and really only skim the surface of what they have to say. So again, if you're interested in their work, that many of their books are available in the library and online. Okay, thanks.